The following is a guide to the paper draft. Now this is a general guide for all the classes that I teach with papers, and so you want to look at the particular information for the paper for your class, but the general draft stuff applies to all of it. Now, the paper itself, in terms of the draft, needs to be printed, because what I like to do is take the paper and write comments on it. It's much quicker and easier to do that than trying to download stuff to Blackboard and type it in and then re-upload it. So for the draft, bring me a printed copy. Now, before the draft deadline, you can drop off copies of your draft during office hours. You can drop them off during class. I even have a drop-off envelope on my office door, which is 203 Tucker Hall, and I check that regularly. Now, when it comes to the dates regarding the draft, there are two important dates. One is the draft due date, and that's essentially pretty early in the semester, and that's kind of a date by which it'd be a really good idea to have at least an initial draft done, especially if you need a particular grade in the class to, say, graduate or keep a scholarship or to keep parents from having an episode. And so that's a suggested date by which to turn in the draft. Now, the draft deadline date is not a suggested date at all. It's the deadline for the draft. And so if you want me to look at a draft, the absolute last time I'd be able to look at it would be the draft deadline date. And that date is typically on the same day as the class that's occurring before the next class in which the paper deadline actually takes place. So for example, if it's in the fall semester and the paper is due, say, on a Wednesday, and I only have office hours, say, on the Monday, then in that case, the deadline would be on that Monday, the end of my office hours. And then in the fall, typically papers are due on a Tuesday, and so the deadline would be the Thursday before that. Although be sure, again, to check the details for your particular class, because of course it varies from semester to semester, depending on when the class is and when my office hours happen to be. Now, the way the draft deadline works is this. I'll look at drafts up until the end of my office hours on that draft deadline date. So what typically ends up happening is that people come in that last hour, and I'll have, say, 10, 15, or 20, or 30 drafts to look at. And what I'll do, to be fair, is read the drafts in order, but I'll take the amount of time that I've got left, say an hour, and divide that by the number of drafts. So if it's if people come in at the last minute and there are 10 drafts and I've got an hour, I'll spend 6 minutes per draft. If I've got 20 drafts and I've got an hour left, I'll spend 3 minutes per draft. And once the deadline goes, it's gone. So if you want a draft looked at, be sure to get the draft in well before the draft deadline. Now, before the draft deadline, you can do as many copies of the draft as you'd like. Turning them in, I'll look at them, get them back to you, and you can stop either when you get the grade you want, or you just get sick of it. And of course, the third thing would be, in this case, when time just runs out. Now, each time I do a draft, I'll put a temporary hypothetical grade on the paper draft. And that way you can see how things are going. And there's no separate draft grade category. So you don't have to worry that if you do a really bad draft that's going to bring your grade down. What happens is, if you do multiple drafts and you get a better grade on the next draft, that replaces the previous grade. And then if you do the final revision, which of course you should do, then the grade you get on that, if it's better than the draft grade, then that replaces it. There's only been one time where a student's revision was actually worse than the draft. Not sure how that happened, neither were they. And so in that case, they got the actual draft grade. Now, there's one exception to this. If a version of the paper is plagiarized, that obviously results in at least a grade of a 0, plus a possibility of academic misconduct, and so that is the exception. So if a version of the paper is plagiarized, that is bad. Now, when you get the draft back, what you'll have on the draft is, numbers and markings, and there'll be various semi-mysterious codes. Now, what these codes are, there'll be letters and numbers, things like O1 or S3 or P1. Now, the common codes will vary from class to class, depending on the paper you're doing. The particular one here on the slide is from the modern philosophy class. Now, so what you'll do when you get the paper back, you'll need that comment and checklist sheet, which is in the paper guide. And what you do is you take a look at the paper, look at the number and letter code, and then you'll see what it is. So, for example, you see an S1 mark there, that says it needs to be more detailed. Or if you see, say, P1 by a quote, that'll mean you have lost a point because you didn't properly cite it, and you should properly cite that. Now, if I have to say something that's not in my comment codes, and these codes are basically things that I found that I say over and over again on the paper, and just to speed up the process of reviewing, I came up with the system, I'll write it out by hand. And if the paper, comments, etc. are not clear, you of course are welcome to stop by during office hours, assuming there's time left, and it's not like the draft deadline date, and I'll be happy to go through it with you. So that's how the comment codes end up working. Now, the main objective is, of course, to get as good a grade as possible on the paper. And this is done basically by doing revisions. Revise, revise, revise. And as I mentioned, each time you revise the paper, I'll turn it into the draft, I'll put comments on it, put the new grade on it, and you can keep doing this until either you get the grade you want or you get sick of it. And then, of course, sort of the ultimate barrier there is time running out. So that's the guide to the paper draft.